the Quran and its science. Then before Ramadan, we entered chapter number 3, and today inshallah we'll continue from that chapter in point number 4. He says mad. He will discuss the affair or the rulings of mad, which is elongation of the voice to a certain extent with one of the following letters. If you have an alif with a sukoon and the letter before it has a fatha, then that is, you do elongation there. Similarly, if you have a waw with a sukoon and the letter before it has a dhamma, or a ya with a sukoon and the letter before it has a kasra, you do what is called mad, which is elongation. Al-mad in its origin is alif. Alif is an expression of two fathas, and it is a natural mad. So example, when you see the scholars of the Quran, tajweed, other than that, they say that this mad is alif wa nisf, and this mad is alifan, and this mad is like this. Alif in itself is two letters, two harakat. If they say alif wa nisf, that means it is 3 harakat. So the origin regarding al-mad is alif, which is 2 harakat. And we'll get to that later on inshallah and discusses the different qurra and how much they elongated. Now al-mad, they say, is 2 types. One is which is connected, muttasil, and one which is munfasil, which is not connected. Now that which is muttasil is obligatory, and that which is munfasil is jaiz. So when you hear maddul wajib and maddul jaiz, that is the difference between the two as well. Now the one that is maddul muttasil and is wajib is that after the letter of elongation there is a hamza, and this is all in one word. Example, Allah says minas samaa'i ma'a. You did the elongation there because it's from mad, that which is muttasil. As-sama is one word and has al-mad in it. In this case, you elongate, and it is, as the scholars of tajweed they mention, in certain instances, wajib. And then there is one that is jaiz, permissible, and that is that the letter of elongation be at the end of the first word, and hamza al-qata' is in the beginning of the other word. Example, qalu amanna. It is not in one word, but rather it's in 2 words. They call this maddul jaiz. Now obviously these rulings you learn from your Quran teacher. The one you're learning Quran from, you learn from them. Right now we're just going to go through it in a summarized version so that we go through the benefits that the author mentioned. So there's those 2 types of mad. One is mad muttasil, and they call it mad which is wajib. And then there is mad elongation, which is munfasil, and they call it jaiz. They call it permissible mad. Now how long do you elongate? You hear sometimes that you should elongate 3 letters, sometimes you hear 5 letters, sometimes you hear 6 letters. You hear this often, that you elongate for this amount of time. Now, the elongation with the qurra, hamza and warsh, they would elongate for 6 letters. They would elongate for 6 letters. As for Asim, the one many of us recite, then he would do 4 or 5 harakat. He would do 4 or 5 harakat. As for Ibn Amir and Al-Kisa'i, they would do 4 harakat, and as for Abu Amr, he would do 3. He would do 3. Now this is just to show us that many of us have not learned anything regarding the other qurra, or the qira'ats that they recite with. So you might find someone reciting a different qira'at and you will be ignorant of it. So it's important we go through books like this so we identify as students of knowledge or students that there are other qira'ats out there and they recite different than the way we recite, and they may even elongate different than the way we elongate. As for the mad al-muttasil, then is elongated, as we mentioned. As for munfasil, Qalun and As-Susi and Ibn Kathir, they would elongate to 2 harakat only. They will elongate to 2 harakat only. So there's difference regarding the elongation of the mad. How long do you elongate it for? So now, as we mentioned, the Quran teacher you're learning for, he will teach you these rulings. But it is good for us to know that these rulings, they exist. That these rulings exist. After that, he says, takhfif al-hamz. Takhfif al-hamza. What does he intend by this? It's mentioned by Ibn al-Jazari that al-hamza is from the heaviest letters to pronounce. Al-hamza is from the heaviest letters to pronounce. And its makhraj is one of the most distant ones. So the Arabs, they like to lighten it. They like to lighten the articulation of hamza. They like to make it lighter. So the Qurra, they have 4 ways to do this. One is an-naql. And naql is that they relay the movement of the hamza to the letter with sukoon before it, and thus the hamza is dropped. Example, Allah says, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ. So here, when we recite it with the hamza. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ. The hamza is made apparent. In some of the qira'at, they do قَدْ أَفْلَحَ. You don't really hear the hamza. They just go with the dal and go straight to the fa. You don't really hear the hamza. This is naql. They did naql. They went from one letter to the next letter without pronouncing the hamza because of how heavy it is to articulate. So those qira'at, they do it like that. Then they have another one that is identified as al-isqat, where they actually drop the hamza. Example, Qalun, in his recitation, his riwayah of recitation, us we will say, فَلَمَّا جَاءَ أَمْرُنَا فَلَمَّا جَاءَ أَمْرُنَا. You hear the hamza. In his recitation, this ayah, he says, فَلَمَّا جَاءَ أَمْرُنَا فَلَمَّا جَاءَ أَمْرُنَا. He dropped that hamza at the end there. This is permissible. As we mentioned before, that there's different qira'at and they've come by way of mutawatir, and it's permissible to recite any one of them, so long as you've learned it. So this is al-isqat. There's another one called ibdal. And many of you who hear warsh, you would hear something like this. فَإِنْهُمْ يَعْلَمُونَ كَمَا تَعْلَمُونَ. They recite فَإِنْهُمْ يَعْلَمُونَ كَمَا تَعْلَمُونَ. They wouldn't pronounce that, they wouldn't articulate the hamza. They would just pronounce it ta'lamun instead of ta'lamun. This is what is known as ibdal. Or example, you hear yu'minun, they say yu'minun. If you heard that before, yu'minun. That's why they recite like that. This is where they get it from. It's called ibdal and takhfif al-hamza. They won't say yu'minun, they will say yu'minun. They won't say mu'minun, they say mu'minun. Because of takhfif al-hamza. The last one is at-tasheel. At-tasheel, in reality, it's difficult. And you'll find that many of the qurra, or those who are proficient in recitation of the Quran and they proficient in these subjects, you'll find that even with them, if you were to hear them, sometimes you wouldn't identify it, that they actually did the tasheel. From that which they mention is a'adh-dhakarain. A'adh-dhakarain. They pronounce in a way where it's tasheel. They made it easy for them to articulate with both hamzas. Instead, a'adh-dhakarain, a'adh-dhakarain. They'll pronounce it like that. You hear both of the hamzas, but it is made lighter. It's made easier upon the tongue to pronounce it. So this is what he mentions, and then he mentioned at the end of these lines of poetry that the details of this subject are in the books which discuss this in detail. So right now we're just taking a summary, just to identify the rulings of why some certain qira'at they recite this way. Example, you see warsh yuminun, you know now why they do it, because they do takhfif al-hamza, they do ibdal. That's why they recite it like that. Or qalun, why do we say falamma ja amruna? If you're very behind him, you may think that he dropped the hamza and he made a mistake. You'll say falamma ja amruna. But rather, that is the way the recitation is, falamma ja amruna, because takhfif al-hamza. Then he says, after that, he'll enter the subject of al-idgham. Al-idgham is known to many of us, and it is to enter something into something. But technically, it is to enter a letter into a next letter which is similar to it or close to it. Now, some of the scholars discuss al-idgham فَضْرِبْ بِعَصَاكَ الْحَجَرِ. فَضْرِبْ bi. So they do the ba, they go together now. You do shadda. They say that is idgham. You enter the other ba into the other ba because they're similar together. But other scholars when they discuss the issue of al-idgham, they mention that there's two types. One is idgham naqis and one is idgham kamil. Idgham naqis is with ghunna. You recite it with ghunna. Okay? And anyone know how many harakat ghunna is? Or it should be two. It should be two harakat ghunna. So you recite it with ghunna, and it's called naqis due to the letter not being there, but its attributes are being present still. And you do this with 4 letters. If it is preceded by noon with a sukoon or tanween. Anyone know those letters? They're 4. It's 4 letters. Ya, noon, mim, and waw. So example, you say, man ya'mal, man ya'mal. You did the ghunna, and then you connected, you drop the noon, and you connected to the ya, the mim to the ya. Now you could still kind of hear the noon, but you've dropped it. The attribute of it is still there, but you have dropped the letter. And then the second type is idgham without ghunna. And it is called kamil due to the letter and the attribute remaining. Example, Allah says, man la'anahu Allah. Man la'anahu Allah. You still hear the noon. مَنْ لَعْنَهُ اللَّهُ وَغَضِبَ عَلَيْهِ. This is done with two letters, and they are lam and ra. Lam and ra. So this is idgham. Idgham, it is either naqis if you have it with ya, mim, nun, waw. If it is preceded by a nun sakina, and it is preceded by a nun with a tanween, then you join. And you dropped that letter or the tanween. If it is lam or ra, then it's called idgham kamil. You don't do ghunna. So it's a mistake to do ghunna in this part. You don't say, no, you don't do that. مَنْ لَعْنَهُ اللَّهُ. Just say it the way it is, without any ghunna. Now, except for in one qira'ah, there is no idgham. In one qira'ah, and that's the qira'ah of Abu Amr, he doesn't do any idgham, except for in two cases. Abu Amr, he does not do idgham except in two places, and that is when we say manasikakum, he used to recite it as manasikkum. Instead of manasikakum, he recite manasikkum. Similarly, you say ma salakakum fi sakar, ma salakkum fi sakar. Ma salakkum fi sakar. So here he did idgham only in these two places, with the two kafs. But in other places he did not do idgham. Then after that he finishes this chapter and he enters into the next chapter, chapter number 4. Some of these subjects we're just going to summarize and go through it so that we identify and know that these exist, these benefits exist. But the detail of this is obviously you go study with the Qurra or you study in the books which discusses in detail. So for us to study this book, we're just going to summarize and go through it so that we identify that there's different qira'at. There's qira'at that we recite different, and there's benefits with that qira'ah. Then he says, chapter number 4 returns to the words, and it is 7. The subject that returns to the alfaz, and it is 7 different categories in this chapter. The first one, he says, the first and second is al-gharib and mu'arrab. Al-gharib and al-mu'arrab. He says that gharib, it returns to it being relayed. Al-gharib in the Quran, words in the Quran are words that its meaning are hidden. Its meaning are hidden and it is in need of explanation. It might be gharib with someone but not with others, but it must be relayed from the speech of the Arabs. So the meaning of it is relayed from the speech of the Arabs. So that is al-gharib, meaning the meaning of it is hidden and is in need of being clarified. And this chapter, the scholars mention, is a beneficial chapter for the mufassirun. This chapter is where the mufassirun, they benefit from. They identify which is gharib, so they try to identify the meaning of that word. And then as for mu'arrab, he says that which has come like mishka. What he intends by mu'arrab is that it has come in other than the Arabic language. There are certain words that has come in other than the Arabic language and they are found in the Quran. And the Arabs, they used it. Now I mentioned some of those words and we'll come to know that the correct stance is in opposition to that statement. But some of the scholars, they say that there are non-Arabic words in the Quran. Some scholars, they hold the stance. Although the correct stance is opposition of that, in opposite to that. But some of the words that they say that are not Arabic and they're found in the Quran, example, mishkah. When Allah says, Allahu nuru samawati wal ard, mathalu nurihi ka mishkatin fiha misbah. They say mishkah, this word mishkah came from the Abyssinians, from Habasha. Some they say, Inna Ibrahim la'awwahun halim. Awwah, they say, came from Habasha as well. They say, Yawma natwi as-sama' qatayyi as-sijil lil-qutub. As-sijil, they say, also came from the Ahbash, from the Abyssinians. And they say, Kiflun also came from them. And Kistas, they say, came from the Romans. So these are some of the words that they say that didn't originally come from the Arabs, but rather they came from, example, the Abyssinians and the Romans. And they mentioned the Quran. But the majority of the scholars, they rejected this. They said this is wrong. Why? They said that even if there are non-Arabic words, they're also found in the Arabic language. There's times when you have a word that is found in your language and someone else's language, and they both originate from that language. So they say that these words are found in both the Arabic language and in the other language. Doesn't mean that they were not found in the Arabic language. Just because it was known in that language doesn't mean it wasn't known in the Arabic language. So majority of the scholars say there is no non-Arabic word in the Quran. There is no non-Arabic word in the Quran. Allah says in the Quran, Inna anzalnahu Qur'anan Arabiyan. We sent it down and revealed as the Arabic Quran, in the Arabic language. This is some of the evidences that they use, and other evidence in the Quran and Sunnah. There is no word that is not Arabic that is found in the Quran. All the words found in the Quran are Arab words. So this is the correct stance of the scholars they mentioned. Ash-Shafi rahimahullah, he used to be severe in rejecting the statement that there are non-Arab words in the Quran. Non-Arabic words in the Quran. He used to reject this severely. So it's important for us to understand that if someone says a statement, this is where they come from. That there are non-Arabic words in the Quran, this is where they get that idea from. Although the correct stance is an opposite to that stance. And some of the scholars even mention that even if one were to say that, argue with them and say there's non-Arabic words in the Quran, that which is literal has no ruling for it. That which is literal in reality has no ruling for it. So the Quran is all Arabic and there's no non-Arabic words in the Quran. Then he mentions, the author, he will enter the subject of majaz. Majaz, it means metaphorical speech. Metaphorical speech. Now this is a chapter which many of the people of innovation have used to spread their innovation by way of it. If you were to tell them, example, Allah says in the Quran, an attribute, example, Allah's hands, they say, no, it's majaz is that it means this and this and this. It doesn't mean hand. Other words as well that they say in the Quran, they say metaphorically speaking. Allah here is metaphorically speaking. The Prophet here is speaking metaphorically. That's wrong. So this subject of majaz will mention a summary of some of the benefits that the scholars they mention. From the Shaykh Abu Amr al-Hajuri, may Allah preserve, he mentions the benefit from Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah, as mentioned Mukhtasar Sawa'iq al-Mursala of Ibn al-Mawsali, that the third thing that the Jahmiyyah placed to negate the reality and the literal sense of the names and attributes of Allah is a taghut of al-majaz. Ibn Qayyim and Shaykh al-Islam rahimahullah, they held that majaz is taghut. It's like a false deity that they use. This taghut is what the latter ones have attached themselves to, and the negators have found refuge in. They have made it a shield in which they guard with it the arrows from the arrows of those who aim at them, and they turn by way of it the reality of the clear revelation. And then he also mentioned that Shaykh al-Islam rahimahullah mentioned that this terminology, in reality, the saying this is majaz and this is haqiqah and this, it was not known at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Nor was it known at the time of the Sahaba. Nor was it known at the time of the Tabi'een. This terminology in itself is innovated. It was not known. And the first one to say this terminology was a man named Abu Ubaidah Ma'mar ibn al-Muthanna. But his use of this word was not what they use it for. His use of this word was as a tafsir, as a clarification, to clarify something. It was not as to use to say this is reality, literal, and this is metaphorical speech. He was not intending that. So you will not find from any of the known scholars in the past, such as Malik, Al-Awza'i, Abu Hanif, and other than them, that they use the word majaz, or that they use the word haqiqah regarding the names of Allah in the Quran. For that reason, as Imam Ibn Uthaymeen rahimahullah mentioned, that there is no majaz in the Quran. There's no metaphorical speech in the Quran. And he says the greatest signs of this being true, that there's no metaphorical speech in the Quran, that majaz is not present in the Quran, is that from the greatest signs of al-majaz is that it is okay to negate it. Is it okay to negate it? And it is not found nothing in the Quran that is okay to negate. Example, what he intends by this, example, if you were to say to someone that so-and-so is a lion, a man is a lion, you can negate that. You can say, no, he's not a lion, he's a human being. Is it yes or no? You can negate that in that sense. Whereas the Quran is not permissible to negate anything of it. So there is no majaz in the Quran. To further add to that, from the scholars, such as Shaykh al-Islam, Ibn Qayyim, and Imam al-Shaykh, and other than them, they mention that there is no majaz in the Quran, nor in the Sunnah, nor in the Arabic language. Nor in the Arabic language. So there's no metaphorical speech in reality in these, in the Quran, the Sunnah, or in the Arabic language. But the speech that you hear is held in accordance to what you are listening, to what you're hearing. So example, you say, I seen a lion giving the khutbah. When you hear that, you know that he's talking about a courageous man. It's not metaphorically speaking. Rather, you know that what he's talking about is a courageous man. So from this aspect, from this point of view, they mention that there's no majaz. In example, was'al al-qarya, ask the village. If you were to say to someone, ask the village, what do you intend by it? To ask the buildings and ask the cars? No, you literally means ask the people of the village. So here they say from this, it is no majaz in the Quran, nor in the Sunnah, nor in the Arabic language. Rather, the speech is held in accordance to the way the Arabs, they understood it. And the Arabs understood, example, was'al al-qarya, they understood it to mean ask the people of the village. Literally, that's what they understood it to mean. Not metaphorically. So from this, inshallah, we'll stop with this. I know it was a bit much of ma'lumat, benefits are mentioned. But as we mentioned before that sometimes with certain classes, it is important that if you want to understand a subject, that you repeat it. You repeat the benefits. And this is important because you find that sometimes you listen to a benefit and you leave the room and you forget it. And as Shaykh Ibn Uthaymeen mentioned, that knowledge in reality is repetition. The more you repeat something, the more you'll benefit and understand it. But if you listen to it now and then later on do not repeat that benefit, you'll forget it. So when it comes to sciences of hadith or science of the Quran or science of Arabic language, all these sciences, the way you'll get strong at it is by repeating it often. You'll get strong in those subjects by often repeating it. Not by just listening to it once and then leaving it alone and then coming back a year later and say, I'm going to benefit again. No, it's done by continuously repeating it. So with this, inshallah, we'll stop. If there's any question, we'll take it now. Yes. The scholar says to Shaykh Uthaymeen, they mentioned that if a person goes to an area where they recite with one qira'ah, he shouldn't recite with different qira'ah because it will cause harm. Now, if he is going to do so, then yes, it's beneficial that he says to them, I'm going to recite this qira'ah. And it happened to many of us, it happened to myself and others as well. You've entered a masjid and you recite a different qira'ah and you think you made a mistake, and then later on you realize and identify that he is actually reciting in a different qira'ah. Because some of these qira'ahs are so close together, they're so close in the different recitations, that it's not that much of a difference. It's not like you're listening to warsh, where you could see the difference of the qira'ah, right away you identify it. Other qira'ahs, you can't identify that easily. So it's good for him to identify that he's reciting. Example, we recite, فَلَمَّا جَاءَ أَمْرُنَا. He's reading Qalun. Someone who's going to come to the masjid later and say, فَلَمَّا جَاءَ أَمْرُنَا. And he's going to keep repeating and trying to correct him. He doesn't understand that he's reciting the recitation of Qalun, where they do takhfif al-hamza and they do isqat. فَلَمَّا جَاءَ أَمْرُنَا. So it's important that you don't do so, but if you're to do so, yeah, you should identify that he recites in a different recitation. Any other questions? Then inshallah we'll stop with this and continue next week.